To finish up that last part, reduced hybrid fertility, I was saying that the horse and the donkey can successfully mate, but their offspring, a mule, even though it's viable, healthy animal, it is infertile. Mules do not produce sperm or eggs, and because of that, the horse and the donkey, based on the biological species concept, that definition, they are classified as being different species. Okay? But the fact that they can produce a viable offspring means that they are relatively very closely related evolutionarily, right? And then this last one, hybrid breakdown, with the example of plants here, grasses, they produce a viable, even fertile offspring, but over time it breaks down and doesn't do so well because of the genetic problems of it being produced by two members of what are still classified as different species. Okay, so post-zygotic barriers that prevent different species from producing healthy, viable, fertile offspring, and in this example, long-term fertile, viable offspring. Okay? So let's look at the mechanisms, the processes that lead to the formation of a new species. So a key event in the origin of a species, the generation of a new species, occurs when a population is cut off from other members or other populations of the original parental species. And that just sets up a whole situation where speciation can occur or macroevolution can occur. So species can form by allopatric speciation. So this is a type of speciation where the initial limit to gene flow, genetic combination or mating, if you will, between isolated populations is when there's a geographic barrier that physically separates the two isolated populations, or an isolated population that is considered a splinter group or a splinter population. Okay? So initially you have one population, one species. Part of it is physically isolated from the other population due to some geographic barrier. And that geographic barrier prevents gene flow mating between the two separated populations. And that leads to speciation between both groups. So again, it's one initial parental species population. There's a splinter group that's isolated reproductively because it is physically isolated due to a geographic barrier. And because of that, the two separated groups basically go down their own separate individual evolutionary paths, and eventually that'll lead to enough microevolutionary change, enough genetic change between the two isolated groups or populations that eventually they will be so different genetically, enough microevolutionary change builds up that they become separate species. And then we say a speciation event has occurred or macroevolutionary event has occurred. Okay? With sympatric, where's my cursor? Here we go. With sympatric speciation, there's a speciation event that occurs without geographic isolation. The two separate groups of the same initial species are still in the same geographic location, but yet speciation event occurs. That's a little more rare, but we'll talk about how that can happen. So allopatric speciation is a little more straightforward. Some geologic processes will separate a population, one species, into two or more isolated populations, and that'll contribute to a speciation event. And since it's the geographic physical isolation that led to the speciation, this type of speciation is called allopatric speciation. The Grand Canyon gives us a good example. If we go back enough, something like 10 million years ago, There was no Grand Canyon. There was just the Colorado River flowing through the land. And there was one population of ground squirrels that was able to get over the river, no big deal, and they would be able to interbreed. Well, as the Grand Canyon developed and cut through the ground and widened the little river valley, eventually now it's a canyon and eventually a Grand Canyon, the one initial population of ground squirrels got isolated geographically, and over evolutionary time, they became separate species. They're closely related, but they cannot physically breed and produce viable offspring, fertile offspring. So because of that, they are separate species, and they speciated because initially they were geographically isolated by the Grand Canyon, and they were then, of course, reproductively isolated. Eventually, the two separate populations of the initially one species became two species. So this type of speciation is called allopatric speciation. So again, the Grand Canyon started first as a river, and eventually it wore down through the land, forming a canyon, and then the Grand Canyon due to geologic erosional processes. Okay? So again, speciation due to a physical separation of a population into separate groups because of the geologic process or some geologic event. All right? And since speciation occurred because they were physically separated due to some geological event, that type of speciation again is allopatric speciation. Okay, so for example, and there's cases of this example here known in California. There's a population migrating. The population encounters a geographic barrier, high mountain range. The organisms cannot survive on the higher mountains, maybe harsh winters. So, as they're moving, migrating, expanding their territory, one group goes one direction, another group goes the other around the geographic barrier. Because of that, now you have two populations of initially one species. They are experiencing genetic change over time, microevolutionary change, and maybe thousands or hundreds of thousands of years later, when their ranges extend beyond the mountain range, beyond the geographic barrier, they come back into contact, but they cannot no longer interbreed for whatever pre-zygotic or even post-zygotic reproductive barriers, as we talked about earlier, because of built-up genetic changes at the microevolutionary level. Because of that, they are now two separate species. Okay? What caused this was the geographic isolation leading to reproductive isolation, reproductive barrier between the two separated groups. Eventually they became two species, allopatric speciation. Down here at the bottom, the populations can no longer interbreed. That's what this is showing you. So that's the speciation event that occurs due to the initial geographic separation. What the top graph is showing you here, that if the population successfully interbreed, then there's no speciation event. They were not reproductively isolated long enough. But down here at the bottom, this graph, or this figure, shows, speciation event has occurred. Why? Geographic barrier produced reproductive isolation. That type of speciation is called allopatric speciation. All right? So, sympatric speciation. Speciation event that occurs when the groups are still geographically in the same region. This can happen. A species may originate from an error during cell division that results in an extra set of chromosomes in their genome. That's actually not that uncommon in plants. And this is called polyploidy, or a polyploidy event. So, if this is survivable, the offspring that's produced has a different set of chromosome numbers than the parent plant, so genetically it's different, and that can prevent reproduction between the parent plant and the new polyploidy plant, and because of that, there are different species now. and there was no geographic separation that led to this. There was just basically a genetic error during cell division, and that means speciation has occurred, sympatric speciation specifically, because there was no reproductive isolation, no reproductive barrier that led to speciation in this example. So polyploid speciation has occurred in some animal species, in some fish and in some amphibians, but again, it's most common in plants. And actually, about 80% of our plant species today are descended from ancestors that apparently arose from polyploid speciation. That's one reason how plants have become so diverse. So two forms of polyploidy are known. One form, polyploidy, can arise from a single parent species, for example, a failure of the cell division with double chromosome number from the original diploid number. So instead of having your 2n diploid genome genetic chromosome number maintained during cell division, if the chromosomes don't separate, you can get a situation where you have additional chromosomes in one of the daughter cells or in one of the gametes. And if the gametes successfully reproduce in the future, then you have now a tetraploid species from an original diploid species, and that tetraploid species will probably not be able to reproduce with the original parental diploid species. So then, by definition, that's a new species. Okay? Or two different species potentially might interbreed that are fairly closely related, and there's no pre- or post-zygotic reproductive barriers that would prevent offspring to be viable and fertile. In this case, a new species might form in that situation, and this has also been documented in plants. So for example, number 2 here is what we see down here. Species A is diploid with 4 chromosomes. Species B is diploid with 6 chromosomes. They form their normal gametes, notice from 4 to 2 chromosomes in the green species, and from 6 to 3 chromosomes in the, we'll call it the purple species. The chromosomes cannot pair appropriately in the sterile hybrid, but plants can reproduce asexually. So if they're able to reproduce asexually, now you can get a potentially viable fertile hybrid species, which is now a diploid number of 10, which is different from this original parental species of 4 chromosomes or this one of 6. And now this thing can go off and reproduce on its own. So a new species has occurred through a type of polyploidy. And again, this is not that uncommon in plants, much more uncommon in animals. So with sympatric speciation, again, speciation that occurs when the organisms, the populations, the members of a species are not geographically isolated. So biologists have identified a few cases in which subpopulations of one species are apparently undergoing sympatric speciation that will likely lead into 2 species. For example, the skunk species with temporal isolation, the isolated garter snake species that don't easily reproduce because of habitat isolation. If enough genetic variation builds up between the separated groups, then even if the temporal isolation is removed or the habitat isolation is removed and the groups come into contact and try to mate, they would not successfully reproduce. Okay? But the most frequently observed mechanism of sympatric speciation involves these large-scale genetic changes called polyploidy that it can occur in one single generation in plants. And we'll continue about speciation events and how speciation actually is accelerated in places like islands in the next